Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Chilliteracy. Hello, happy Wednesday and happy New Year! And thank you very much, Harpress, for the raid. Welcome in. I hope everybody is doing well. I hope you had a good stream, that it was chill and harpy and with cats, probably. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Boop to you too. But yes, hello everybody. Welcome back to our usual Chilliteracy streams, 2025 edition. It was very harpy. Good, marvellous, excellent. But yes, how are we all doing? I hope everybody has had a good sort of festive period. Yeah, obviously we were around on Monday for a Chilliteracy, but for everybody who wasn't able to attend, hello, happy New Year. Hope we've had a good Christmas, New Year, etc. And that 25 has started okay for everyone. On the Cat of the Year, the last day is Tip of Tail Day and 1st of January is Boop Day. Oh, excellent. I like that. There were also definitely cats. Also good. Cats are good things to have around. Almost 4 years, Thunder. Thank you very much indeed for the resub. 4 years in August, blimey, yeah. That's when we started this channel. August, I think. 2025 has started icily. Yeah, it started snowily for us. Icily and snowily. It is currently snowing, which is rather nice. And it has actually settled, which is kind of slightly unusual. Sad you missed Monday, but you've just started your newest placement, so everything has been busy. Ooh, well, I mean, I hope that is going well and that it is good for you. Yeah. I don't know what news we have in terms of snow is perfectly cosy for reading. It is indeed. You had a bit of freezing rain today. Oh, that's exciting. It was the end of August. Remember, Sam sent you a message telling me that you about the channel just after your birthday. Oh, nice. But yes, it was indeed late August when we started this ear channel. And we were having a conversation actually the other day about how many years it's been. And it's been... Oh, God, he's going to correct me again now. It's been... This is we're going into our 4th year, I think, of doing this. Because we only did Book Week from year 2 onwards, I think. People can correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, in theory, I think we've been doing this for 4 years. And we still haven't run out of fiction, which was genuinely our concern when we began this channel. We're like, we're not going to be able to, fill up more than like a year with classic fiction. Oh, how wrong we were, as you all are very well aware, because you know what? One book can take a whole year if you read it weekly. Turns out there is a lot of fiction in the world. This is true, yeah. It's going really well, Thunder? Excellent. Very much enjoying it. Less a fan. Oh, yeah, driving in the ice is not fun. I had to drive back from taking a choir rehearsal last night, and the road was glittery, which is always a little bit disconcerting. So, yeah, would not advise driving in the ice, but yeah, take care and all that. You're doing a Les Mis... I'm going to say Les Mis because everybody says Les Mis. Virtual book club this year. Nice! Oh, 1 chapter a day for 365 days. Nice. That's actually a really good idea. Glittery roads are indeed beautiful, but they are terrifying. This is very true. But yes, for everybody who wasn't there on Monday, we were chatting about various things, about how to, make Chilliteracy better, anything that you guys would like to have from us, anything you would like us to do more of, less of. We have sort of decided that we're going to do with our Chilliteracy streams, we're going to split them so we don't have sort of a bit of chatting and then a bit of game. We're going to do separate streams there, so we'll do like a full podcasty chatty stream one Monday a month, and then another Monday a month probably, we'll do a talking over the games, just so that we get through the games that we're doing a little bit quicker, and also that, you know, we don't feel like we are pressured to stop talking, because goodness knows we can talk for Britain. So yeah, that was one thing we decided. We've added a couple new channels on the Discord, one of which is the Vibes Gallery, which we are encouraging people to use. Basically, we'd like, rather than just like a photos kind of channel of art or landscapes or whatever, we decided that it would be quite cool for people to, you know, upload pictures, photos of, like, I don't know, vibes, landscape, whatever, that kind of they compare with either music or words. So I think Sam did the first post in there and put some like some foggy pictures he'd taken a couple of weeks back, and paired it with a little Spotify playlist he constructed. So yeah, the whole idea with that channel is it's kind of, I don't know, inspirational in the sense that it's like, here's a bunch of vibes for people. You can either just admire the vibes, enjoy the vibes, or, you know, garner some kind of inspiration from them and creativity and stuff. So that was one place. And the other channel was film recommendations, mainly for Andy Pants at this point, because we keep on mentioning like old horror films and just like old films and things like that, that we would love to do more like film nights basically on the Discord, as we have been starting to do. You have a film recommendation? Bung it in there then, Thunder. But yeah, basically every time we've said, it's like, oh, we should do more like film nights on the Discord, and he's just been like, I've got so many recommendations. So and lo and behold, Andy put a lot of recommendations in there, so thank you, Andy. Not a horror film, it doesn't have to be horror films, can be any kind of films. Amazing as a chill one. Okay. A chillage, I like that. So yeah, that's I guess pretty much everything we talked about on Monday. We had other things. What did we say? What other things did we talk about? Excuse me, I'm yawning, because that is what I do. We want to do another, hopefully it's old enough. Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be old. Yeah, we discussed maybe... Oh, you thought of another one, thanks. Great, excellent, thanks, Andy. Yeah, we thought maybe it would be cool at some point maybe to do just like more sort of like one-off event type streams, something chill like a jigsaw stream or something. We'd like to do, we'd certainly like to carry on with the Choose Your Own Adventure streams with Dave that we started last year. So yeah, just hopefully more stuff basically. Also, hello, Lady Mephistopheles. Hope you are well. But yeah, so I mean, today obviously we're back to the usual schedule of Sam still needs to finish The Human Chord. I think we're on part 5 now, I'm not entirely sure. And so I am back on the short stories, and as per the book I showed everybody who was there on Monday, I am reading from the, I think, part of the collection of massive, like 2-inch thick books that I have bought from the second-hand bookshop that's local to me. One of which was the Sea Stories, one of which was the what was it? The Mammoth Book of Ghosts, Thrillers and Mysteries or something. But this one is A Century of Thrillers from Poe to Harlan. And it has a very dramatic cover, and it's very old and threadbare, but I kind of love it. And it smells good. Yeah, old book smell. So we're gonna be reading a couple of those from that today, because I am on the short stories at the moment. But yes, the first one we've got today is actually from a longer Dickens novel called The Pickwick Papers, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may have read. I have read because I was a... I want to say I was masochistic, but no, that's not true, because I love Dickens. But I decided to read all of Dickens a couple of years back. I don't actually know how long it took me. I should have probably timed it, but I think it probably took me maybe a year. No, it must have taken me more than a year. Our mutual friend alone must have taken me, Bleak House must have taken me at least like a couple of months. I don't know, maybe not. I read fast. But yeah, I decided a little while back to just read all of the Dickens collection I have, because I have a collection of Dickens, as frankly does everybody in the UK seem to have. I feel like it's a bit like the Discworld. There are so many people who have just the entire lot. Yeah, and the Pickwick Papers it's a good Dickens book. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily his best, but it's good. And the story in here is actually from that, and it's quite fun. Also, hello Sam. Hi here but lurking. I hope you are well. But yeah, so yes, we don't have any other things to talk about, do we? I'm yawning, I'm sorry. Oh, excuse me. I have had a stressful day. I went to the dentist. I hate dentists. There are reasons for me hating dentists. And today did not help. So I have been very stressed today. But you know what? A bit of reading will help. Oof, dentists. Yeah, dentists suck. And thankfully the dentist I'm with now is like, they seem like a good place. And yeah, I had a dental hygienist appointment today, basically. And basically everyone I talk to, including them, about my previous experiences with dentists, are like, oh yeah, oh I'm sorry, that's bad. Because yeah, I've had some fun dentist experiences, including people trying to pull teeth out without anaesthetic, people pulling the wrong teeth out, just generally bad. Your sister-in-law is a dentist and she's amazing, but you still hate going? Yeah. I don't know anyone who likes dentists. Your dentist is super nice. Well, that's good, Parola. But yeah, I hate anything to do with teeth anyway. But yeah, just that on top of just some really bad experiences when I was younger. I'm talking like when I was a teenager / kid. It's kind of scarred me for life when it comes to dentists. So yeah, me no likey dentists, not fun. Anything in your mouth that isn't food or drink from a sensory perspective? Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think also it's just the whole thing of just like not being in control. And obviously everything to do with like your mouth and teeth always feels worse, and like if you like bite your cheek, it feels like a giant crater in your cheek kind of thing. Like everything feels bigger and worse than it actually is. Also, the dentistic science has gone so far these days. Yeah, I know. Like, we're just going to talk about dentists for a sec. Like the one thing I was saying to her today, I was like, I really hate the adverts that are, if you have blood in your toothpaste when you spit your toothpaste out, this could be a sign of gum disease. And she's like, no, that's just what gums do. Gums bleed. That's normal. That's not really, unless they're bleeding all the time, that's nothing really to be worried about. That's kind of normal. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, no one ever told me that. So I was always terrified. So it's just like, yeah. Just don't you love advertising? It's wonderful. You haven't had any problems, things are probably fine, but you don't wanna. Yeah, I know. That was kind of the same with me, Andy. It's like I hadn't been in like 10 years because of fear. Yeah, like I've never had fillings, I've never had anything like that, but yeah, when I had teeth pulled, it was just my milk teeth. But yeah, don't like dentists. Blah. I never got with dentists, certainly in the UK. I don't know if this is a thing worldwide, but like, here, like, good job, you've done a good dentist session to the kid. Here's a lollipop. It's like, what? Aren't you meant to be telling us not to eat loads of sugar? Why are you giving children sweets after sorting their teeth out? Okay. Ensuring repeat business. Yeah, that's probably why, actually. Good point. I did today get, like, you get brave patient stickers. I want a brave patient sticker. I didn't get a brave patient sticker. I just got a flipping discount for an electric toothbrush. Today, at least. If your filling falls out after 5 years, it's not your fault. Oh yeah, that yeah. You got free toothbrushes and pencils with holographic glitter stuff. Well, that sounds fun. Oh, that sounds much better. Gives you a new toothbrush. That's great. I never got new toothbrushes from my dentist. Most of your milk teeth needed to be pulled because they didn't come out on their own. Yeah, that was kind of my problem as well. I was a bit like a shark for maybe a few weeks because I had 2 rows of teeth on my bottom teeth. It was great. We never got toothbrushes. Boo. Maybe our dentist was just crap. But anyway, lollipop should be, is it xylitol or xylitol? It's good for your teeth in moderation. Didn't know that. Your dentist still gives you... Why? I need a better dentist. Boo. Anyway, shall we, after we've chatted about dentists for ages, apologies for that, but you know, I've had a... Oh, it's in chewing gum. Oh, of course, yes. But yes, I've had a day. Shall we sit back and relax and begin our 2 short stories of the evening with, from the Pickwick Papers, The Story of the Bagman's Uncle by Charles Dickens. My uncle, gentlemen, said the bagman, was one of the merriest, pleasantest, cleverest fellows that ever lived. I wish you had known him, gentlemen. On second thoughts, gentlemen, I don't wish you had known him, for if you had, you would have been all by this time in the ordinary course of nature, if not dead, at all events so near it as to have taken to stopping at home and giving up company, which would have deprived me of the inestimable pleasure of addressing you at this moment. Gentlemen, I wish your fathers and mothers had known my uncle. They would have been amazingly fond of him, especially your respectable mothers. I know they would. If any 2 of his numerous virtues predominated over the many that adorned his character, I should say they were his mixed punch and his after-supper song. Excuse my dwelling on these melancholy recollections of departed worth. You won't see a man like my uncle every day in the week. I have always considered it a great point in my uncle's character, gentlemen, that he was the intimate friend and companion of Tom Smart, of the great house of Bilson and Slum, Catteaton Street, City. My uncle collected for Tiggin and Whelps, but for a long time he went pretty near the same journey as Tom, and the very first night they met, my uncle took a fancy for Tom, and Tom took a fancy for my uncle. They made a bet of a new hat before they had known each other half an hour, who should brew the best quart of punch and drink it the quickest. My uncle was indeed to have won the making, but Tom Smart beat him in the drinking by about half a salt spoonful. They took another quart apiece to drink each other's health in, and were staunch friends ever afterwards. There's a destiny in these things, gentlemen. We can't help it. In personal appearance, my uncle was a trifle shorter than the middle size. He was a thought stouter, too, than the ordinary run of people, and perhaps his face might be a shade redder. He had the jolliest face you ever saw, gentlemen, something like Punch, with a handsomer nose and chin. His eyes were always twinkling and sparkling with good humour, and a smile, not one of your unmeaning wooden grins, but a real merry, hearty, good-tempered smile, was perpetually on his countenance. He was pitched out of his gig once and knocked head first against a milestone. There he lay, stunned, and so cut about the face with some gravel which had been heaped up alongside it, that, to use my uncle's own strong expression, if his mother could have revisited the earth, she wouldn't have known him. Indeed, when I come to think of the matter, gentlemen, I feel pretty sure she wouldn't, for she died when my uncle was 2 years and 7 months old, and I think it's very likely that, even without the gravel, his top boots would have puzzled the good lady not a little, to say nothing of his jolly red face. However, there he lay, and I have heard my uncle say many a time that the man said who picked him up that he was smiling as merrily as if he had tumbled out for a treat, and that after they had bled him, the first faint glimmerings of returning animation were his jumping up in bed, bursting out into a loud laugh, kissing the young woman who held the basin, and demanding a mutton chop and a pickled walnut instantly. He was very fond of pickled walnuts, gentlemen. He said he always found that, taken without vinegar, they relished the beer. My uncle's great journey was in the fall of the leaf, at which time he collected debts and took orders in the north, going from London to Edinburgh, from Edinburgh to Glasgow, from Glasgow back to Edinburgh, and thence to London by the smack. You are to understand that his second visit to Edinburgh was for his own pleasure. He used to go back for a week, just to look up his old friends, and what with breakfasting with this one, lunching with that, dining with a third, and supping with another, a pretty tight week he used to make of it. I don't know whether any of you gentlemen ever partook of a real substantial hospitable Scotch breakfast, and then went out to a slight lunch of a bushel of oysters, a dozen or so of bottled ale, and a noggin or two of whisky to close up with. If you ever did, you will agree with me that it requires a pretty strong head to go out to dinner and supper afterwards. But bless your hearts and eyebrows, all this sort of thing was nothing to my uncle. He was so well seasoned that it was mere child's play. I have heard him say that he could see the Dundee people out any day and walk home afterwards without staggering. And yet the Dundee people have as strong heads and as strong punch, gentlemen, as you are likely to meet with between the poles. I have heard of a Glasgow man and a Dundee man drinking against each other for 15 hours at a sitting. They were both suffocated, as nearly as could be ascertained, at the same moment, but with this trifling exception, gentlemen, that they were not a bit the worse for it. One night, within 24 hours of the time when he had settled to take shipping for London, my uncle supped at the house of a very old friend of his, a Bailey Mac something and 4 syllables after it, who lived in the old town of Edinburgh. There were the Bailey's wife and the Bailey's 3 daughters, and the Bailey's grown-up son, and 3 or 4 stout, bushy-eyebrowed, canty old Scotch fellows that the Bailey had got together to do honour to my uncle and help to make merry. It was a glorious supper. There were kippered salmon, and finnan haddocks, and a lamb's head, and a haggis, a celebrated Scotch dish, gentlemen, which my uncle used to say always looked to him, when it came to table, very much like a Cupid's stomach, and a great many other things besides that I forget the names of, but very good things notwithstanding. The lassies were pretty and agreeable, the Bailey's wife one of the best creatures that ever lived, and my uncle in thoroughly good cue, the consequence of which was that the young ladies tittered and giggled, and the old lady laughed out loud, and the Bailey and the other old fellows roared till they were red in the face the whole mortal time. I don't quite recollect how many tumblers of whisky toddy each man drank after supper, but this I know, that about 1 o'clock in the morning the Bailey's grown-up son became insensible while attempting the first verse of Willie Brewed a Peck o' Malt, and he having been, for half an hour before, the only other man visible above the mahogany, it occurred to my uncle that it was almost time to think about going, especially as drinking had set in at 7 o'clock, in order that he might get home at a decent hour. But, thinking it might not be quite polite to go just then, My uncle voted himself into the chair, mixed another glass, rose to propose his own health, addressed himself in a neat and complimentary speech, and drank the toast with great enthusiasm. Still nobody woke, so my uncle took a little drop more, neat this time so to prevent the toddy disagreeing with him, and laying violent hands on his hat, sallied forth into the street. It was a wild, gusty night when my uncle closed the Bailey's door, and setting his hat firmly on his head to prevent the wind from taking it, thrust his hands into his pockets, and, looking upwards, took a short survey of the state of the weather. The clouds were drifting over the moon at their giddiest speed, at one time wholly obscuring her, at another suffering her to burst forth in full splendour and shed her light on all the objects around, anon driving over her again with increased velocity and shrouding everything in darkness. "Really, this won't do," said my uncle, addressing himself to the weather as if he felt himself personally offended. "This is not at all the kind of thing for my voyage. It will not do at any price," said my uncle very impressively. Having repeated this several times, he recovered his balance with some difficulty, for he was rather giddy with looking up into the sky so long, and walked merrily on. The Bailey's house was in the Cannon Gate, and my uncle was going to the other end of Leith Walk, rather better than a mile's journey. On either side of him there shot up against the dark sky tall, gaunt, straggling houses with time-stained fronts and windows that seemed to have shared the lot of eyes in mortals and to have grown dim and sunken with age. 6, 7, 8 stories high were the houses, story piled above story, as children build with cards, throwing their dark shadows over the roughly paved road and making the dark night darker. A few oil lamps scattered at long distances, but they only served to mark the dirty entrance to some narrow close, or to show where a common stair communicated by steep and intricate windings with the various flats above. Glancing at all these things with the air of a man who had seen them too often before to think them worthy of much notice now, my uncle walked up the middle of the street with a thumb in each waistcoat pocket, indulging from time to time in various snatches of song, chanted forth with such good-will and spirit that the quiet, honest folk started from their first sleep and lay trembling in bed till the sound died away in the distance, when, satisfying themselves that it was only some drunken ne'er-do-well finding his way home, they covered themselves up warm and fell asleep again. I am particular in describing how my uncle walked up the middle of the street with his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets, gentlemen, because, as he often used to say, and with great reason too, there is nothing at all extraordinary in this story, unless you distinctly understand at the beginning that he was not by any means of a marvellous or romantic turn. Gentlemen, my uncle walked on with his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets, taking the middle of the street to himself, and singing now a verse of a love song, and then a verse of a drinking one, and when he was tired of both, whistling melodiously, until he reached the North Bridge, which, at this point, connects the old and new towns of Edinburgh. Here he stopped for a minute, to look at the strange irregular clusters of lights piled one above the other, and twinkling afar off, so high in the air that they looked like stars, gleaming from the castle walls on the one side, and the Calton Hill on the other, as if they illuminated veritable castles in the air, while the old picturesque town slept heavily on, in gloom and darkness below, its palace and chapel of Holyrood guarded day and night, as a friend of my uncle's used to say, by old Arthur's seat, towering, surly and dark, like some gruff genius over the ancient city he has watched so long. I say, gentlemen, my uncle stopped here for a minute to look about him, and then, paying a compliment to the weather, which had a little cleared up, though the moon was sinking, walked on again as royally as before, keeping the middle of the road with great dignity, and looking as if he should very much like to meet with somebody who would dispute possession of it with him. There was nobody at all disposed to contest the point as it happened, and so on he went, with his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets, like a lamb. When my uncle reached the end of Leith Walk, he had to cross a pretty large piece of waste ground, which separated him from a short street which he had to turn down to go direct to his lodging. Now, in this piece of waste ground, there was at that time an enclosure belonging to some wheelwright who contracted with the post office for the purchase of old worn-out mail coaches, and my uncle, being very fond of coaches, old, young, or middle-aged, all at once took it into his head to step out of his road for no other purpose than to peep between the palings at these mails, about a dozen of which he remembered to have seen crowded together in a very forlorn and dismantled state inside. My uncle was a very enthusiastic, emphatic sort of person, gentlemen, so finding that he could not obtain a good peep between the palings, he got over them, and sitting himself quietly down on an old axle-tree, began to contemplate the mail coaches with a deal of gravity. There might be a dozen of them, or there might be more. My uncle was never quite certain on this point, and being a man of very scrupulous veracity about numbers, didn't like to say, but there they stood, all huddled together in the most desolate condition imaginable. The doors had been torn from their hinges and removed, the linings had been stripped off, only a shred hanging here and there by a rusty nail. The lamps were gone, the poles had long since vanished, the ironwork was rusty, the paint worn away, the wind whistled through the chinks in the bare woodwork, and the rain which had collected on the roofs fell, drop by drop, into the insides with a hollow and melancholy sound. They were the decaying skeletons of departed mails, and in that lonely place, at that time of night, they looked chill and dismal. My uncle rested his head upon his hands and thought of the busy, bustling people who had rattled about years before in the old coaches and were now as silent and changed. He thought of the numbers of people to whom one of those crazy, mouldering vehicles had borne, night after night, for many years, and through all weathers, the anxiously expected intelligence, the eagerly looked-for remittance, the promised assurance of health and safety, the sudden announcement of sickness and death. The merchant, the lover, the wife, the widow, the mother, the schoolboy, the very child who tottered to the door at the postman's knock, how had they all looked forward to the arrival of the old coach? And where were they all now? Gentlemen, my uncle used to say that he thought all this at the time, but I rather suspect he learnt it out of some book afterwards, for he distinctly stated that he fell into a kind of doze as he sat on the old axle-tree looking at the decayed mail coaches, and that he was suddenly awakened by some deep church bell striking 2. Now, my uncle was never a fast thinker, and if he had thought all these things, I am quite certain it would have taken him till full 2:30 o'clock, at the very least. I am, therefore, decidedly of opinion, gentlemen, that my uncle fell into a kind of doze, without having thought about anything at all. Be this as it may, a church bell struck 2. My uncle woke, rubbed his eyes, and jumped up in astonishment. In one instant after the clock had struck 2, the whole of this deserted and quiet spot had become a scene of most extraordinary life and animation. The mail coach doors were on their hinges. The lining was replaced. The ironwork was as good as new. The paint was restored. The lamps were alight. Cushions and greatcoats were on every coach box. Porters were thrusting parcels into every boot. Guards were stowing away letter bags. Hostlers were dashing pails of water against the renovated wheels. Numbers of men were rushing about, fixing poles into every coach. Passengers arrived. Portmanteaus were handed up. Horses were put to. And, in short, it was perfectly clear that every mail there was to be off directly. Gentlemen, my uncle opened his eyes so wide at all this that, to the very last moment of his life, he used to wonder how it fell out that he had never ever been able to shut them again. "Now then," said a voice, as my uncle felt a hand on his shoulder, "you're booked for one inside. You better get in." "I booked?" said my uncle, turning around. "Yes, certainly." My uncle, gentlemen, could say nothing. He was so very much astonished. The queerest thing of all was that although there was such a crowd of persons, and although fresh faces were pouring in every moment, there was no telling where they came from. They seemed to start up in some strange manner from the ground or the air, and disappear in the same way. When a porter had put his luggage in the When the porter had put his luggage in the coach and received his fare, he turned round and was gone, and before my uncle had well begun to wonder what had become of him, 6 fresh ones started up and staggered along under the weight of parcels which seemed big enough to crush them. The passengers were all dressed so oddly too. Large, broad-skirted, laced coats with great cuffs and no collars, and wigs, gentlemen, great formal wigs and a tie behind. My uncle could make nothing of it. "Now, are you going to get in?" said the person who had addressed my uncle before. He was dressed as a mail guard, with a wig on his head and most enormous cuffs to his coat, and had a lantern in one hand and a huge blunderbuss in the other, which he was going to stow away in his little arm-chest. "Are you going to get in, Jack Martin?" said the guard, holding the lantern to my uncle's face. "Hello," said my uncle, falling back a step or two. "That's familiar." "It's so on the waybill," replied the guard. "Isn't there a Mr. before it?" said my uncle, for he felt, gentlemen, that for a guard he didn't know to call him Jack Martin was a liberty. For a guard he didn't know to call him Jack Martin was a liberty which the post office wouldn't have sanctioned if they had known it. "No, there is not," said the guard coolly. "Is the fare paid?" inquired my uncle. "Of course it is," rejoined the guard. "It is it?" said my uncle. "Then here goes. Which coach?" "This," said the guard, pointing to an old-fashioned Edinburgh and London mail, which had the steps down and the door open. "Stop. Here are the other passengers. Let them get in first." As the guard spoke, there all at once appeared, right in front of my uncle, a young gentleman in a powdered wig and a sky-blue coat trimmed with silver, made very full and broad in the skirts, which were lined with buckram. Tiggin and whelps were in the printed calico and waistcoat piece-line, gentlemen, so my uncle knew all the materials at once. He wore knees breeches and a kind of leggings rolled up over his silk stockings, and shoes with buckles. He had ruffles at his wrists, a 3-cornered hat on his head, and a long taper sword by his side. The flaps of his waistcoat came halfway down his thighs, and the ends of his cravat reached to his waist. He stalked gravely to the coach door, pulled off his hat, and held it above his head at arm's length, cocking his little finger in the air at the same time, as some affected people do when they take a cup of tea. Then he drew his feet together and made a low, grave bow, and then put out his left hand. My uncle was just going to step forward and shake it heartily when he perceived that these attentions were directed not towards him, but to a young lady who just then appeared at the foot of the steps, attired in an old-fashioned green velvet dress, with a long waist and stomacher. She had no bonnet on her head, gentlemen, which was muffled in a black silk hood, but she looked round for an instant as she prepared to get into the coach, and such a beautiful face as she discovered my uncle had never seen, not even in a picture. She got into the coach, holding up her dress with one hand, and, as my uncle always said with a round oath when he told the story, he wouldn't have believed it possible that legs and feet could have been brought to such a state of perfection unless he had seen them with his own eyes. But in this one glimpse of the beautiful face, my uncle saw that the young lady had cast an imploring look upon him, and that she appeared terrified and distressed. He noticed, too, that the young fellow in the powdered wig, notwithstanding his show of gallantry, which was all very fine and grand, clasped her tight by the wrist when she got in, and followed himself immediately afterwards. An uncommonly ill-looking fellow, in a close brown wig and a plum-coloured suit, wearing a very large sword and boots up to his hips, belonged to the party. And when he sat himself down next to the young lady, who shrunk into a corner at his approach, my uncle was confirmed in his original impression that something dark and mysterious was going forward, or, as he always said himself, that there was a screw loose somewhere. It's quite surprising how quickly he made up his mind to help the lady at any peril, if she needed help. "Death and lightning!" exclaimed the young gentleman, laying his hand upon his sword as my uncle entered the coach. "Blood and thunder!" roared the other gentleman. With this, he whipped his sword out and made a lunge at my uncle without further ceremony. My uncle had no weapon about him, but with great dexterity he snatched the ill-looking gentleman's three-cornered hat from his head, and receiving the point of his sword right through the crown, squeezed the sides together and held it tight. "Pink him behind!" cried the ill-looking gentleman to his companion as he struggled to regain his sword. "He had better not!" cried my uncle, displaying the heel of one of his shoes in a threatening manner. "I'll kick his brains out if he has any, or fracture his skull if he hasn't." Exerting all his strength at this moment, my uncle wrenched the ill-looking man's sword from his grasp and flung it clean out of the coach window, upon which the younger gentleman vociferated "Death and lightning!" again, and laid his hand upon the hilt of his sword in a very fierce manner, but didn't draw it. Perhaps, gentlemen, as my uncle used to say with a smile, perhaps he was afraid of alarming the lady. "Now, gentlemen," said my uncle, taking his seat deliberately, "I don't want to have any death, with or without lightning, in a lady's presence, and we have had quite blood and thundering enough for one journey. So, if you please, we'll sit in our places like quiet insides. Here, guard, pick up that gentleman's carving knife." As quickly as my uncle said the words, the guard appeared at the coach window with the gentleman's sword in his hand. He held up his lantern and looked earnestly in my uncle's face. As he handed it in, when, by its light, my uncle saw, to his great surprise, that an immense crowd of mail coach guards swarmed round the window, every one of whom had his eyes earnestly fixed upon him too. He had never seen such a sea of white faces and red bodies and earnest eyes in all his born days. "This is the strangest sort of thing I ever had anything to do with," thought my uncle. "Allow me to return your hat, sir." The ill-looking gentleman received his three-cornered hat in silence, looked at the hole in the middle with an inquiring air, and finally stuck it on the top of his wig, with a solemnity the effect of which was a trifle impaired by his sneezing violently at the moment and jerking it off again. "All right," cried the guard with the lantern, mounting into his little seat behind. Away they went. My uncle peeped out of the coach window as they emerged from the yard, and observed that the other mails, with coachman, guards, horses and passengers complete, were driving round and round in circles at a slow trot of about 5 miles an hour. My uncle burnt with indignation, gentlemen. As a commercial man, he felt that the mail-bags were not to be trifled with, and he resolved to memorialise the post office on the subject the very instant he reached London. At present, however, his thoughts were occupied with the young lady who sat in the farthest corner of the coach, with her face muffled closely in her hood, the gentleman with the sky-blue coat sitting opposite to her, and the other man in the plum-coloured suit at her side, and both watching her intently. If she so much as rustled the folds of her hood, he could hear the ill-looking man clap his hand upon his sword, and could tell by the other's breathing, it was so dark he couldn't see his face, that he was looking as big as if he were going to devour her, as if he were going to devour her at a mouthful. This roused my uncle more and more, and he resolved, come what might, to see the end of it. He had a great admiration for bright eyes, and sweet faces, and pretty legs and feet. In short, he was fond of the whole sex. It runs in our family, gentlemen. So am I. Many were the devices which my uncle practised to attract the lady's attention, or, at all events, to engage the mysterious gentleman in conversation. They were all in vain. The gentleman wouldn't talk, and the lady didn't dare. He thrust his head out of the coach window at intervals and bawled out to know why they didn't go faster. But he called till he was hoarse. Nobody paid the least attention to him. He leant back in the coach and thought of the beautiful face, of the feet and legs. This answered better. It whiled away the time, and kept him from wondering where he was going, and how it was he found himself in such an odd situation. Not that this would have worried him much anyway. He was a mighty free and easy, roving, devil-may-care sort of person, was my uncle, gentlemen. All of a sudden the coach stopped. "Hello," said my uncle. "What's in the wind now?" "A light here," said the guard, letting down the steps. "Here?" cried my uncle. "Here," rejoined the guard. "I'll do nothing of the sort," said my uncle. "Very well, then stop where you are," said the guard. "I will," said my uncle. "Do," said the guard. The other passengers had regarded this colloquy with great attention, and finding that my uncle was determined not to alight, the younger man squeezed past him to hand the lady out. At this moment the ill-looking man was inspecting the hole in the crown of his three-cornered hat. As the young lady brushed past, she dropped one of her gloves into my uncle's hand and softly whispered with her lips so close to his face that he felt her warm breath on his nose, the single word, "Help." Gentlemen, my uncle leaped out of the coach at once, with such violence that it rocked on the springs again. "Oh, you've thought better of it, have you?" said the guard, when he saw my uncle standing on the ground. My uncle looked at the guard for a few seconds, in some doubt whether it wouldn't be better to wrench his blunderbuss from him, fire it in the face of the man with the big sword, knock the rest of the company over the head with the stock, snatch up the young lady, and go off in the smoke. On second thoughts, however, he abandoned this plan as being a shade too melodramatic in the execution, and followed the two mysterious men, who, keeping the lady between them, were now entering an old house, in front of which the coach had stopped. They turned into the passage, and my uncle followed. Of all the ruinous and desolate places my uncle had ever beheld, this was the most so. It looked as if it had once been a large house of entertainment, but the roof had fallen in many places, and the stairs were steep, rugged, and broken. There was a huge fireplace in the room into which they walked, and the chimney was blackened with smoke, but no warm blaze lighted it up now. The white feathery dust of burnt wood was still strewed over the hearth, but the stove was cold, and all was dark and gloomy. "Well," said my uncle as he looked about him, "a mail travelling at the rate of 6 miles and a half an hour, and stopping for an indefinite time at such a hole as this, is rather an irregular sort of proceeding, I fancy. This shall be made known. I'll write to the papers." My uncle said this in a pretty loud voice, and in an open, unreserved sort of manner, with the view of engaging the two strangers in conversation if he could. But neither of them took any more notice of him than whispering to each other and scowling at him as they did so. The lady was at the farther end of the room, and once she ventured to wave her hand as if beseeching my uncle's assistance. At length the two strangers advanced a little, and the conversation began in earnest. "You don't know this is a private room, I suppose, fellow?" said the gentleman in sky blue. "No, I do not, fellow," rejoined my uncle. "Only if this is a private room specially ordered for the occasion, I should think the public room must be a very comfortable one." With this my uncle sat himself down in a high-backed chair, and took such an accurate measure of the gentleman with his eyes that Tiggin and Whelps could have supplied him with printed calico for a suit, and not an inch too much or too little from that estimate alone. "Quit this room," said both the men together, grasping their swords. "Eh?" said my uncle, not at all appearing to comprehend their meaning. "Quit the room, or you are a dead man," said the ill-looking fellow with the large sword, drawing it at the same time and flourishing it in the air. "Down with him!" cried the gentleman in sky blue, drawing his sword also, and falling back 2 or 3 yards. "Down with him!" The lady gave a loud scream. Now, my uncle was always remarkable for great boldness and great presence of mind. All the time that he had appeared so indifferent to what was going on, he had been looking slyly about for some missile or weapon of defence, and at that very instant when the swords were drawn, he espied, standing in the chimney-corner, an old basket-hilted rapier in a rusty scabbard. At one bound, my uncle caught it in his hand, drew it, flourished it gallantly above his head, called aloud to the lady to keep out of the way, hurled the chair at the man in sky blue and the scabbard at the man in plum colour, and taking advantage of the confusion, fell upon them both pell-mell. Gentlemen, there is an old story, none the worse for being true, regarding a fine young Irish gentleman who, being asked if he could play the fiddle, replied he had no doubt he could, but he couldn't exactly say for certain because he had never tried. This is not inapplicable to my uncle and his fencing. He had never had a sword in his hand before, except once when he played Richard III at a private theatre, upon which occasion it was arranged with Richmond that he was to be run through from behind without showing fight at all. But here he was, cutting and slashing with 2 experienced swordsmen, thrusting and guarding and poking and slicing, and acquitting himself in the most manful and dexterous manner possible, although up to that time he had never been aware that he had the least notion of the science. It only shows how true the old saying is, that a man never knows what he can do until he tries, gentlemen. The noise of the combat was terrific, each of the 3 combatants swearing like troopers, and their swords clashing with as much noise as if all the knives and steels in Newport Market were rattling together at the same time. When it was at its very height, the lady, to encourage my uncle most probably, withdrew her hood entirely from her face, and disclosed a countenance of such dazzling beauty that he would have fought against 50 men to win one smile from it and die. He had done wonders before, but now he began to powder away like a raving mad giant. At this very moment, the gentleman in sky blue, turning round and seeing the young lady with her face uncovered, vented an exclamation of rage and jealousy, and turning his weapon against her beautiful bosom, pointed a thrust at her heart, which caused my uncle to utter a cry of apprehension that made the building ring. The lady stepped aside, and, snatching the young man's sword from his hand before he had recovered his balance, drove him to the wall, and running it through him and the panelling up to the very hilt, pinned him there, hard and fast. It was a splendid example. My uncle, with a loud shout of triumph and a strength that was irresistible, made his adversary retreat in the same direction, and plunging the old rapier into the very centre of a large red flower in the pattern of his waistcoat, nailed him beside his friend. There they both stood, gentlemen, jerking their arms and legs about in agony, like the toy shop figures that are moved by a piece of pack-thread. My uncle always said afterwards that this was one of the surest means he knew of for disposing of an enemy, but it was liable to one objection on the ground of expense, inasmuch as it involved the loss of a sword for every man disabled. "The mail! The mail!" cried the lady, running up to my uncle and throwing her beautiful arms around his neck. "We may yet escape." "May?" cried my uncle. "Why, my dear, there's nobody else to kill, is there?" My uncle was rather disappointed, gentlemen, for he thought a little quiet bit of love-making would be agreeable after the slaughtering, if it were only to change the subject. "We have not an instant to lose here," said the young lady. "He," pointing to the young gentleman in sky blue, "is the only son of the powerful Marquess of Philipteville." "Well then, my dear, I'm afraid he'll never come to the title," said my uncle, looking coolly at the young gentleman as he stood fixed up against the wall, in the cockchafer fashion I have described. "You have cut off the entail, my love." "I have been torn away from my home and friends by these villains," said the young lady, her features glowing with indignation. "That wretch would have married me by violence in another hour." "Confound his impudence!" said my uncle, bestowing a very contemptuous look on the dying heir of Philipteville. "As you may guess from what you have seen," said the young lady, "the party were prepared to murder me if I appealed to anyone for assistance. If their accomplices find us here, we are lost. 2 minutes hence may be too late. The mail!" With these words, overpowered by her feelings and the exertion of sticking the young Marquess of Philipteville, she sunk into my uncle's arms. My uncle caught her up and bore her to the house door. There stood the mail, with 4 long-tailed, flowing-maned black horses, ready harnessed, but no coachman, no guard, no hostler even at the horses' heads. Gentlemen, I hope I do no injustice to my uncle's memory when I express my opinion that although he was a bachelor, he had held some ladies in his arms before this time. I believe indeed that he had rather a habit of kissing barmaids, and I know that in 1 or 2 instances he had been seen by credible witnesses to hug a landlady in a very perceptible manner. I mention the circumstances to show what a very uncommon sort of person this beautiful young lady must have been to have affected my uncle in the way she did. He used to say that, as her long dark hair trailed over his arm, and her beautiful dark eyes fixed themselves upon his face when she recovered, he felt so strange and nervous that his legs trembled beneath him. But who can look in a sweet soft pair of dark eyes without feeling queer? I can't, gentlemen. I am afraid to look at some eyes I know, and that's the truth of it. "You will never leave me," murmured the young lady. "Never," said my uncle, and he meant it too. "My dear preserver," exclaimed the young lady, "my dear, kind, brave preserver." "Don't," said my uncle, interrupting her. "Why?" inquired the young lady. "Because your mouth looks so beautiful when you speak," rejoined my uncle, that I am afraid I shall be rude enough to kiss it." The young lady put up her hand as if to caution my uncle not to do so, and said— No, she didn't say anything. She smiled. When you are looking at a pair of the most delicious lips in the world and see them gently break into a roguish smile, if you are very near them and nobody else by, you cannot better testify your admiration of their beautiful form and colour than by kissing them at once. My uncle did so, and I honour him for it. "Hark!" cried the young lady, starting. "The noise of wheels and horses." "So it is," said my uncle, listening. He had a good ear for wheels and the tramping of hoofs, but there appeared to be so many horses and carriages rattling towards them from a distance that it was impossible to form a guess at their number. The sound was like that of 50 brakes, with 6 blood cattle in each. "We are pursued!" cried the young lady, clasping her hands. "We are pursued! I have no hope but in you!" There was such an expression of terror in her beautiful face that my uncle made up his mind at once. He lifted her into the coach, told her not to be frightened, pressed his lips to hers once more, and then, advising her to draw up the window to keep the cold air out, mounted to the box. "Stay, love!" cried the young lady. "What's the matter?" said my uncle from the coach-box. "I want to speak to you," said the young lady. only a word, dearest." "Must I get down?" inquired my uncle. The lady made no answer, but she smiled again. Such a smile, gentlemen! It beat the other one all to nothing. My uncle descended from his perch in a twinkling. "What is it, my dear?" said my uncle, looking in at the coach window. The lady happened to bend forward at the same time, and my uncle thought she looked more beautiful than she had done yet. He was very close to her just then, gentlemen, so he really ought to know. "What is it, my dear?" said my uncle. "Will you never love anyone but me? Never marry anyone besides?" said the young lady. My uncle swore a great oath that he would never marry anyone else, and the young lady drew in her head and pulled up the window. He jumped upon the box, squared his elbows, adjusted the ribbons, seized the whip which lay on the roof, gave one flick to the off-leader, and away went the 4 long-tailed, flowing-maned black horses at 15 good English miles an hour, with the mail coach behind them. Whew, how they tore along! The noise behind grew louder. The faster the old mail went, the faster came the pursuers. Men, horses, dogs were leagued in the pursuit. The noise was frightful, but above all rose the voice of the young lady, urging my uncle on and shrieking, "Faster! Faster!" They whirled past the dark trees as feathers would be swept before a hurricane. Houses, gates, churches, haystacks, objects of every kind they shot by, with a velocity and noise like roaring waters suddenly let loose. Still the noise of pursuit grew louder, and still my uncle could hear the young lady wildly screaming, "Faster! Faster!" My uncle plied whip and rein, and the horses flew onward till they were white with foam, and yet the noise behind increased, and yet the young lady cried, "Faster, faster!" My uncle gave a loud stamp on the boot in the energy of the moment, and found that it was grey morning, and he was sitting in the wheelwright's yard on the box of an old Edinburgh mail, shivering with the cold and wet, and stamping his feet to warm them. He got down and looked eagerly inside for the beautiful young lady. Alas, there was neither door nor seat to the coach. It was a mere shell. Of course, my uncle knew very well that there was some mystery in the matter, and that everything had passed exactly as he used to relate it. He remained staunch to the great oath he had sworn to the beautiful young lady, refusing several eligible landladies on her account, and dying a bachelor at last. He always said what a curious thing it was that he should have found out by such mere accident as his clambering over the palings that the ghosts of mail coaches and horses, guards, coachmen and passengers were in the habit of making journeys regularly every night. He used to add that he believed he was the only living person who had ever been taken as a passenger on one of these excursions, and I think he was right, gentlemen. At least I never heard of any other. "I wonder what these ghosts of mail coaches carry in their bags," said the landlord, who had listened to the whole story with profound attention. "The dead letters, of course," said the bagman. "Oh, to be sure," rejoined the landlord. "I never thought of that." The end. I hope you all enjoyed that one. That was definitely ghosts, and definitely not just a guy who had drunk far too much and fallen asleep and had a weird dream. Dead letters, I know. Good punchline there at the end. Excellent stuff. Thank you, Dickens. Yeah, Diana, you came in like right in the middle of that. And it was all a dream. Yes, the context was he had just, like, the uncle had just come back from, like, a really, really long binge, basically, with a bunch of friends. So it was very... You did arrive with thrilling sword fight. And yeah, just for the punchline. So that, yeah, that is a character in the Pickwick Papers telling a story. And yes, it is kind of meant to be just sort of horse joke type thing. Long joke, very silly punchline. But thank you very much, Diana, for resubscribing. Woo! And welcome in. Hope you are well. Also, who have I missed? Ray Tracer also. Thank you very much for the resub and welcome in. Hope you are well. Happy New Year. And Shitehawk, 3 corners. I know, right? 3 corners on a hat in this economy. Madness. Hope you're doing well. Welcome in. Oh yeah, we have a thank you very much. Oddtistic Endeavour. Great name. I'm glad you like the channel name and concept. Welcome in. I hope you are enjoying what we are doing. But yes, that was the Bagman's uncle, a sort of story within a story from Dickens's The Pickwick Papers, which may or may not be a ghost story depending on how you read it. Loved that. It's great. You also, unfortunately, Diana, you missed oh flipping it, what was it? Someone repeated it. Bless Your Hearts and Eyebrows is a very good Dickens is hilarious, yeah. Bless Your Hearts and Eyebrows is a phrase in that, which is great. Stealing that. There was another good one. Hang on. I'm going to have to find it again. Where did it go? It was Bless Your Hearts and Eyebrows and where was it? Death and Lightning was another one, and Blood and Thunder. Just very good phrases. Just really good phrases. Yeah, and Bless Your Hearts and Eyebrows. Excellent stuff. So yeah, there were a lot of very good phrases in that, and just yeah, very much Dickens going, I'm just gonna do a little stand-up comedy sketch in the middle of my book. Is that all right, everyone? Great. Okay, I'm gonna just do that now. So yes. You need to go, Harpers? No worries. I hope you sleep well or whatever it is you're doing. Thank you very much for being here and for the raid. Also, Thunder, I saw you vanished earlier, so hope you whatever you're doing is all good, and thank you for being here. But yes, we shall go to a break, yeah, go do break related things, and we shall be back in about 5 minutes. Bye for now. And we return. Welcome back, everybody. I hope we have had a good break and done break-related things. Cycled those fluids. No. Cycled those fluids, that's the word. And yeah, done other stuff. I personally stood up, walked around the room a bit, and looked outside at the snow. Because it be snowing. Oh lord, it's snowing. So, yeah. That is what I did. break-related puzzling. Oh yeah, I hope the puzzling is going well. Oh yeah, for people who weren't there on Monday, on a fluid cycle. Yep. Yeah. We did several jigsaws over the Christmas period. I mean, I probably did more jigsawing than Sam did, but that was mainly because I was helping other people do their jigsaws. My mum got my dad, well, I say my mum got my dad a jigsaw. She also got her a jigsaw. Like, it was very much a jigsaw that she got for both of them to do, and also me if I felt like it, and I did. It was very difficult, but it was good. It was like a sort of nature scene type thing, and then I got given a Discworld jigsaw, which is great. And actually, I feel like, Diana, if you're into jigsaws, I can definitely lend it to you because I think it's one you'd like. But that was surprisingly, I mean, it was 1,000 pieces, but it took under 24 hours. So, which Sam and I managed to do. And it was quite fun as well because it was like, yeah, it's basically like a group photo of all the Discworld characters, or as many of the Discworld characters as they could fit in. So it's quite fun sort of going through going, oh, that's so-and-so, that's so-and-so. And then 18 hours of hardcore jigsaws, yeah. I mean, frankly, it's very difficult to pull me away from a jigsaw once I've started it. Yeah. I will just sit there and do a jigsaw. You avoided falling on ice for a solid half mile. Well, that's good. I am glad. But yes, so jigsaws have been jigsawed. But now people are talking about jigsaws. I'm like, oh. Your mum is addicted to one-line jigsaws. That's great. Did I just say that? Have I just repeated myself? Have I just read chat out twice? Oh, I'm doing well. It's fine. Everything's fine. I've had just too many words in Dickens. Of course. Sam has found a cool jigsaw site. For anyone who wants to see some very cool jigsaws. It's a very cool idea. And there are some very cool jigsaws. Yeah. So there you go. Anyway, I'm going to start reading a second story, otherwise we're going to be here all night. So, if we're all sitting comfortably, we've got two sort of stalwarts of English fiction, I guess. We've had Dickens, and now we've got some Trollope, which is still just a great surname. So, yeah, I hope everybody is sitting comfortably, has, hot beverage or something. And yeah, we shall continue with... Oh, link for the text. Good point. One moment, I did have it saved, and I completely forgot to do it in the break. Knew there was something I'd forgotten. Boop, getting absolutely trolloped. Nice. Name gives you black books flashbacks. Is there a Trollope in flashbooks? God, my brain is just words. Yes, anyway. Right. This is Malachi's Cove by Anthony Trollope. On the northern coast of Cornwall, between Tintagel and Bossiny, down on the very margin of the sea, there lived not long since an old man who got his living by saving seaweed from the waves and selling it for manure. The cliffs there are bold and fine, and the sea beats in upon them from the north with a grand violence. I doubt whether it be not the finest morsel of cliff scenery in England, though it is beaten by many portions of the west coast of Ireland, and perhaps also by spots in Wales and Scotland. Cliffs should be nearly precipitous. They should be broken in their outlines, and should barely admit here and there of an insecure passage from their summit to the sand at their feet. The sea should come, if not up to them, at least very near to them. And then, above all things, the water below them should be blue, and not of that dead leaden colour which is so familiar to us in England. At Tintagel all these requisites are there, except that bright blue colour which is so lovely. but the cliffs themselves are bold and well broken, and the margin of sand at high water is very narrow, so narrow that at spring tides there is barely a footing there. Close upon this margin was the cottage or hovel of Malachi Trengloss, the old man of whom I have spoken. But Malachi, or Old Gloss, as he was commonly called by the people around him, had not built his house absolutely upon the sand. There was a fissure in the rock so great that at the top it formed a narrow ravine, and so complete from the summit to the base that it afforded an opening for a steep and rugged track from the top of the rock to the bottom. This fissure was so wide at the bottom that it had afforded space for Trengloss to fix his habitation on a foundation of rock, and here he had lived for many years. It was told of him that in the early days of his trade he had always carried the weed in a basket on his back to the top, but latterly he had been possessed of a donkey which had been trained to go up and down the steep track with a single pannier over his loins, for the rocks would not admit of panniers hanging by his side, and for this assistant he had built a shed adjoining his own, and almost as large as that in which he himself resided. But as years went on, Old Gloss procured other assistance than that of the donkey, or, as I should rather say, Providence supplied him with other help, and indeed, had it not been so, the old man must have given up his cabin and his independence and gone into the workhouse at Camelford. For rheumatism had afflicted him, old age had bowed him till he was nearly double, and by degrees he had become unable to attend the donkey on its upward passage to the world above, or even to assist in rescuing the coveted weed from the waves. At the time to which our story refers, Trengloss had not been up the cliff for 12 months, and for the last 6 months he had done nothing towards the furtherance of his trade, except to take the money and keep it, if any of it was kept, and occasionally to shake down a bundle of fodder for the donkey. The real work of the business was done altogether by Mahala Trengloss, his granddaughter. Mally Trengloss was known to all the farmers round the coast, and to all the small tradespeople in Camelford. She was a wild-looking, almost unearthly creature, with wild, flowing, black, uncombed hair, small in stature, with small hands and bright black eyes. But people said that she was very strong, and the children around declared that she worked day and night, and knew nothing of fatigue. As to her age, there were many doubts. Some said she was 10, others 25, but the reader may be allowed to know that at this time she had in truth passed her 20th birthday. The old people spoke well of Mally, because she was so good to her grandfather, and it was said of her that though she carried to him a little gin and tobacco almost daily, she brought nothing for herself. And as to the gin, no one who looked at her would accuse her of meddling with that. But she had no friends, and but few acquaintances among people of her own age. They said that she was fierce and ill-natured, that she had not a good word for anyone, and that she was, complete at all points, a thorough little vixen. The young men did not care for her, for, as regarded dress, all days were alike with her. She never made herself smart on Sundays. She was generally without stockings, and seemed to care not at all to exercise any of those feminine attractions which might have been hers had she studied to attain them. All days were the same to her in regard to dress, and indeed till lately all days had, I fear, been the same to her in other respects. Old Malachi had never been seen inside a place of worship since he had taken to live under the cliff. But within the last 2 years Mally had submitted herself to the teaching of the clergyman at Tintagel, and had appeared at church on Sundays, if not absolutely with punctuality, at any rate so often that no one who knew the peculiarity of her residence was disposed to quarrel with her on that subject. But she made no difference in her dress on these occasions. She took her place on a low stone seat just inside the church door, clothed as usual in her thick red serge petticoat and loose brown serge jacket, such being the apparel which she had found to be best adapted for her hard and perilous work among the waters. She had pleaded to the clergyman when he attacked her on the subject of church attendance with vigour that she had got no church-going clothes. He had explained to her that she would be received there without distinction to her clothing. Mally had taken him at his word, and had gone with a courage which certainly deserved admiration, though I doubt whether there was not mingled with it an obstinacy which was less admirable. For people said that old Gloss was rich, and that Mally might have proper clothes if she chose to buy them. Mr. Polwarth, the clergyman, who, as the old man could not come to him, went down the rocks to the old man, did make some hint on the matter in Mally's absence. But old Gloss, who had been patient with him on other matters, turned upon him so angrily when he made an allusion to money that Mr. Polwarth found himself obliged to give that matter up, and Mally continued to sit upon the stone bench in her short serge petticoat, with her long hair streaming down her face. She did so far sacrifice to decency as on such occasions to tie up her black hair with an old shoestring. So tied it would remain through the Monday and Tuesday, but by Wednesday afternoon Mally's hair had generally managed to escape. As to Mally's indefatigable industry, there could be no manner of doubt, for the quantity of seaweed which she and the donkey amassed between them was very surprising. Old Gloss, it was declared, had never collected half what Mally gathered together. But then the article was becoming cheaper, and it was necessary that the exertion should be greater. So Mally and the donkey toiled and toiled, and the seaweed came up in heaps, which surprised those who looked at her little hands and light form. Was there not someone who helped her at nights, some fairy or demon or the like? Mally was so snappish in her answers to people that she had no right to be surprised if ill-natured things were said of her. No one ever heard Mally Trengloss complain of her work, but about this time she was heard to make great and loud complaints of the treatment she received from some of her neighbours. It was known that she went with her plaints to Mr. Polwarth, and when he could not help her, or did not give her such instant help as she needed, she went, so foolishly, to the office of a certain attorney at Camelford, who was not likely to prove himself a better friend than Mr. Polwarth. Now, the nature of her injury was as follows. The place in which she collected her seaweed was a little cove. The people had come to call it Malachi's Cove, from the name of the old man who lived there, which was so formed that the margin of the sea therein could only be reached by the passage from the top down to Trengloss's hut. The breadth of the cove, when the sea was out, might perhaps be 200 yards, and on each side the rocks ran out in such a way that both from north and south the domain of Trengloss was guarded from intruders. And this locality had been well chosen for its intended purpose. There was a rush of sea into the cove, which carried there large drifting masses of seaweed, leaving them among the rocks when the tide was out. During the equinoctial winds of the spring and autumn the supply would never fail, and even when the sea was calm, the long, soft, salt-bedewed, trailing masses of the weed could be gathered there when they could not be found elsewhere for miles along the coast. The task of getting the weed from the breakers was often difficult and dangerous, so difficult that much of it was left to be carried away by the next incoming tide. Mally doubtless did not gather half the crop that was there at her feet. What was taken by the returning waves she did not regret, but when interlopers came upon her cove and gathered her wealth, her grandfather's wealth, beneath her eyes, then her heart was broken. It was this interloping, this intrusion, that drove poor Mally to the Camelford attorney. But alas, though the Camelford attorney took Mally's money, he could do nothing for her, and her heart was broken. She had an idea, in which no doubt her grandfather shared, that the path to the cove was, at any rate, their property. When she was told that the cove and sea running into the cove were not the freeholds of her grandfather, she understood that the statement might be true. But what, then, as to the use of the path? Who had made the path what it was? Had she not painfully, wearily, with exceeding toil, carried up bits of rock with her own little hands, that her grandfather's donkey might have footing for his feet? Had she not scraped together crumbs of earth along the face of the cliff, that she might make easier to the animal the track of that rugged way? And now, when she saw big farmers' lads coming down with other donkeys, and indeed there was one who came with a pony, no boy, but a young man, old enough to know better than rob a poor man and a young girl, she reviled the whole human race, and swore that the Camelford attorney was a fool. Any attempt to explain to her that there was still weed enough for her was worse than useless. Was it not all hers and his, or at any rate, was not the sole way to it his and hers? And was not her trade stopped and impeded? Had she not been forced to back her laden donkey down 20 yards, she said, but it had in truth been 5, because Farmer Gunliff's son had been in the way with his thieving pony. Farmer Gunliff had wanted to buy her weed at his own price, and because she had refused, he had set on his thieving son to destroy her in this wicked way. "I'll hamstring the beast next time as he's down here," said Mally to old Gloss, while the angry fire literally streamed from her eyes. Farmer Gunliff's small homestead, he held about 50 acres of land, was close by the village of Tintagel, and not a mile from the cliff. The sea rack, as they call it, was pretty well the only manure within his reach, and no doubt he thought it hard that he should be kept from using it by Mally Trengloss and her obstinacy. "There's heaps of other coves, Barty," said Mally to Barty Guncliffe, the farmer's son. "But none so high, Mally, nor yet none that fills themselves at this place." Then he explained to her that he would not take the weed that came up close to hand. He was bigger than she was, and stronger, and would get it from the outer rocks, with which she never meddled. Then, with scorn in her eye, she swore that she could get it where he durst not venture, and repeated her threat of hamstringing the pony. Barty laughed at her wrath, jeered her because of her wild hair, and called her a mermaid. "I'll mermaid you!" she cried. "Mermaid indeed! I wouldn't be a man to come and rob a poor girl and an old cripple. But you're no man, Barty Guncliffe. You're not half a man." Nevertheless, Bartholomew Guncliffe was a very fine young fellow, as far as the eye went. He was about 5 feet 8 inches high, with strong arms and legs, with light curly brown hair and blue eyes. His father was but in a small way as a farmer, but nevertheless Barty Guncliffe was well thought of among the girls around. Everybody liked Barty, excepting only Mally Trengloss, and she hated him like poison. Barty, when he was asked why so good-natured a lad as he persecuted a poor girl and an old man, threw himself upon the justice of the thing. It wouldn't do at all, according to his view, that any single person should take upon himself to own that which God Almighty sent as the common property of all. He would do Mally no harm, and so he had told her. But Mally was a vixen, a wicked little vixen, and she must be taught to have a civil tongue in her head. When once Mally would speak to him civil as he went for weed, he would get his father to pay the old man some sort of toll for the use of the path. "Speak him civil," said Mally. "Never! Not while I have a tongue in my mouth." And I fear old Gloss encouraged her rather than otherwise in her view of the matter. But her grandfather did not encourage her to hamstring the pony. Hamstringing a pony would be a serious thing, and old Gloss thought might be very awkward for both of them if Mally were put into prison. He suggested, therefore, that all manner of impediments should be put in the way of the pony's feet, surmising that the well-trained donkey might be able to work in spite of them. And Barty Guncliffe, on his next descent, did find the passage very awkward when he came near to Malachi's hut, but he made his way down, and poor Mally saw the lumps of rock at which she had laboured so hard pushed on one side or rolled out of the way, with a steady persistency of injury towards herself that almost drove her frantic. "Well, Barty, you're a nice boy," said old Gloss, sitting in the doorway of the hut as he watched the intruder. I ain't a-doing no harm to none as doesn't harm me," said Barty. "The sea's free to all, Malachi." "And the sky's free to all, but I mustn't get up on the top of your big barn to look at it," said Mally, who was standing among the rocks with a long hook in her hand. The long hook was the tool with which she worked in dragging the weed from the waves. "But you ain't got no justice, nor yet no sperrit, or you wouldn't come here to vex an old man like he." "I didn't want to vex him, nor yet to vex you, Mally. You let me be for a while, and we'll be friends yet." "Friends?" exclaimed Mally. "Who'd have the likes of you for a friend? What are you moving them stones for? Them stones belongs to grandfather." And in her wrath she made a movement as though she were going to fly at him. "Let him be, Mally," said the old man. "Let him be. He'll get his punishment. He'll come to be drowned some day if he comes down here when the wind is inshore." "That he may be drowned then," said Mally in her anger. "If he was in the big hole there among the rocks, and the sea running in at half-tide, I wouldn't lift a hand to help him out." "Yes, you would, Mally. You'd fish me up with your hook like a big stick of seaweed." She turned from him with scorn as he said this, and went into the hut. It was time for her to get ready for her work, and one of the great injuries done her lay in this, that such a one as Barty Guncliffe should come and look at her during her toil among the breakers. It was an afternoon in April, and the hour was something after 4 o'clock. There had been a heavy wind from the northwest all the morning, with gusts of rain, and the seagulls had been in and out of the cove all day, which was a sure sign to Mally that the incoming tide would cover the rocks with weed. The quick waves were now returning with wonderful celerity over the low reefs, and the time had come at which the treasure must be seized if it was to be garnered on that day. By 7 o'clock it would be growing dark, at 9 it would be high water, and before daylight the crop would be carried out again if not collected. All this Mally understood very well, and some of this Barty was beginning to understand also. As Mally came down with her bare feet, bearing her long hook in her hand, she saw Barty's pony standing patiently on the sand, and in her heart she longed to attack the brute. Barty, at this moment, with a common 3-pronged fork in his hand, was standing down on a large rock, gazing forth towards the waters. He had declared that he would gather the weed only at places which were inaccessible to Mally, and he was looking out that he might settle where he would begin. "Let un be, let un be," shouted the old man to Mally, as he saw her take a step towards the beast, which she hated almost as much as she hated the man. Hearing her grandfather's voice through the wind, she desisted from her purpose, if any purpose she had had, and went forth to her work. As she passed down the cove and scrambled in among the rocks, she saw Barty still standing on his perch. Out beyond, the white curling waves were cresting and breaking themselves with violence, and the wind was howling among the caverns and abutments of the cliff. Every now and then there came a squall of rain, and though there was sufficient light, the heavens were black with clouds. A scene more beautiful might hardly be found by those who love the glories of the coast. The light for such objects was perfect. Nothing could exceed the grandeur of the colours, the blue of the open sea, the white of the breaking waves, the yellow sands, or the streaks of red and brown which gave such richness to the cliff. But neither Mally nor Barty were thinking of such things as these. Indeed, they were hardly thinking of their trade after its ordinary forms. Barty was meditating how he might best accomplish his purpose of working beyond the reach of Mally's feminine powers, and Mally was resolving that wherever Barty went, she would go farther. And, in many respects, Mally had the advantage. She knew every rock in the spot, and was sure of those which gave a good foothold, and sure also of those which did not. And then her activity had been made perfect by practice for the purpose to which it was to be devoted. Barty, no doubt, was stronger than she, and quite as active. But Barty could not jump among the waves from one stone to another as she could do, nor was he as yet able to get aid in his work from the very force of the water as she could get it. She had been hunting seaweed in that cove since she had been an urchin of 6 years old, and she knew every hole and corner and every spot of vantage. The waves were her friends, and she could use them. She could measure their strength, and knew when and where it would cease. Mally was great down in the salt pools of her own cove, great and very fearless. As she watched Barty make his way forward from rock to rock, she told herself gleefully that he was going astray. The curl of the wind as it blew into the cove would not carry the weed up to the northern buttresses of the cove, and then there was the great hole just there, the great hole of which she had spoken when she wished him evil. And now she went to work, hooking up the dishevelled hairs of the ocean and landing many a cargo on the extreme margin of the sand, from whence she would be able in the evening to drag it back before the invading waters would return to reclaim the spoil. And on his side also Barty made his heap up against the northern buttresses of which I have spoken. Barty's heap became big, and still bigger, so that he knew, let the pony work as he might, he could not take it all up that evening. But it still was not as large as Mally's heap. Mally's hook was better than his fork, and Mally's skill was better than his strength. And when he failed in some haul, Mally would jeer him with a wild, weird laughter, and shriek to him through the wind that he was not half a man. At first he answered her with laughing words, but before long, as she boasted of her success and pointed to his failure, he became angry, and then he answered her no more. He became angry with himself in that he missed so much of the plunder before him. The broken sea was full of the long, straggling growth which the waves had torn up from the bottom of the ocean, but the masses were carried past him, away from him, nay, once or twice over him, and then Mally's weird voice would sound in his ear, jeering him. The gloom among the rocks was now becoming thicker and thicker, and the tide was beating in with increased strength, and the gusts of wind came with quicker and greater violence. But still he worked on. While Mally worked, he would work, and he would work for some time after she was driven in. He would not be beaten by a girl. The great hole was now full of water, but of water which seemed to be boiling as though in a pot. And the pot was full of floating masses, large treasures of seaweed which were thrown to and fro upon its surface, but lying there so thick that one would seem almost able to rest upon it without sinking. Mally knew well how useless it was to attempt to rescue aught from the fury of that boiling cauldron. The hole went in under the rocks, and the side of it towards the shore lay high, slippery, and steep. The hole, even at low water, was never empty, and Mally believed that there was no bottom to it. Fish thrown in there could escape out to the ocean miles away. So Mally in her softer moods would tell the visitors to the cove. She knew the hole well. Pool na Diol she was accustomed to call it, which was supposed, when translated, to mean that this was the hole of the evil one. Never did Mally attempt to make her own of weed which had found its way into that pot. But Barty Guncliffe knew no better, and she watched him as he endeavoured to steady himself on the treacherously slippery edge of the pool. He fixed himself there and made a haul, with some small success. How he managed it she hardly knew, but she stood still for a while, watching him anxiously, and then she saw him slip. He slipped and recovered himself, slipped again and again recovered himself. "Barty, you fool!" she screamed. "If you get yourself pitched in there, you'll never come out no more." Whether she simply wished to frighten him, or whether her heart relented and she had thought of his danger with dismay, who shall say? She could not have told herself. She hated him as much as ever, but she could hardly have wished to see him drowned before her eyes. "You go on and don't mind me," said he, speaking in a hoarse, angry tone. "Mind you? Who minds you?" retorted the girl, and then she again prepared herself for her work. But as she went down over the rocks with her long hook balanced in her hands, she suddenly heard a splash, and turning quickly round, saw the body of her enemy tumbling amidst the eddying waves in the pool. The tide had now come up so far that every succeeding wave washed into it and over it from the side nearest to the sea, and then ran down again back from the rocks as the rolling wave receded, with a noise like the fall of a cataract. And then, when the surplus water had retreated for a moment, the surface of the pool would be partly calm, though the fretting bubbles would still boil up and down, and there was even a simmer on the surface, as though, in truth, the cauldron were heated. But this time of comparative rest was but a moment, for the succeeding breaker would come up almost as soon as the foam of the preceding one had gone, and then again the waters would be dashed upon the rocks, and the sides would echo with the roar of the angry wave. Instantly Mally hurried across to the edge of the pool, crouching down upon her hands and knees for security as she did so. As a wave receded, Barty's head and face was carried round near to her, and she could see that his forehead was covered with blood. Whether he were alive or dead, she did not know. She had seen nothing but his blood and the light-coloured hair of his head lying amidst the foam. Then his body was drawn along by the suction of the retreating wave, but the mass of water that escaped was not on this occasion large enough to carry the man out with it. Instantly Mally was at work with her hook, and getting it fixed into his coat, dragged him towards the spot on which she was kneeling. During the half-minute of repose she got him so close that she could touch his shoulder. Straining herself down, laying herself over the long bending handle of the hook, she strove to grasp him with her right hand, but she could not do it. She could only touch him. Then came the next breaker, forcing itself on with a roar, looking to Mally as though it must certainly knock her from her resting place and destroy them both. But she had nothing for it but to kneel and hold by her hook. What prayer passed through her mind at that moment for herself or for him, or for that old man who was sitting unconsciously up at the cabin, who can say? The great wave came and rushed over her as she lay almost prostrate, and when the water was gone from her eyes, and the tumult of the foam and the violence of the roaring breaker had passed by her, she found herself at length upon the rock, while his body had been lifted up, free from her hook, and was lying upon the slippery ledge, half in the water and half out of it. As she looked at him in that instant, she could see that his eyes were open, and that he was struggling with his hands. "Hold by the hook, Barty!" she cried, pushing the stick of it before him, while she seized the collar of his coat in her hands. Had he been her brother, her lover, her father, she could not have clung to him with more of the energy of despair. He did contrive to hold by the stick which she had given him, and when the succeeding wave had passed by, he was still on the ledge. In the next moment, she was seated a yard or two above the hole, in comparative safety, while Barty lay upon the rocks with his still bleeding head resting upon her lap. What could she do now? She could not carry him, and in 15 minutes the sea would be up where she was sitting. He was quite insensible and very pale, and the blood was coming slowly, very slowly, from the wound on his forehead. Ever so gently she put her hand upon his hair to move it back from his face, and then she bent over his mouth to see if he breathed, and as she looked at him, she knew that he was beautiful. What would she not give that he might live? Nothing now was so precious to her as his life, as the life which she had so far rescued from the waters. But what could she do? Her grandfather could scarcely get himself down over the rocks, if indeed he could succeed in doing so much as that. Could she drag the wounded man backwards, if it were only a few feet, so that he might lie above the reach of the waves till further assistance could be procured? She set herself to work, and she moved him, almost lifting him. As she did so, she wondered at her own strength, but she was very strong at that moment. Slowly, tenderly, falling on the rocks herself so that he might fall on her, she got him back to the margin of the sand, to a spot which the waters would not reach for the next 2 hours. Here her grandfather met them, having seen at last what had happened from the door. "Dada," she said, "he fell into the pool yonder, and was battered against the rocks. See there at his forehead." "Mally, I'm thinking that he's dead already," said old Gloss, peering down over the body. "No, Dada, he is not dead, but mayhap he's dying. But I'll go at once up to the farm." "Mally," said the old man, "look at his head. They'll say we murdered him." "Who'll say so? Who'll lie like that? Didn't I pull him out of the hole?" "What matters that? His father'll say we killed him." It was manifest to Mally that whatever anyone might say hereafter, her present course was plain before her. She must run up the path to Gunliffe's farm and get necessary assistance. If the world were as bad as her grandfather said, it would be so bad that she would not care to live longer in it. But be that as it might, there was no doubt as to what she must do now. So away she went, as fast as her naked feet could carry her up the cliff. When at the top she looked round to see if any person might be within ken, but she saw no one. So she ran with all her speed along the headland of the cornfield which led in the direction of old Gunliffe's house, and as she drew nearer to the homestead, she saw that Barty's mother was leaning on the gate. As she approached, she attempted to call, but her breath failed her for any purpose of loud speech, so she ran on till she was able to grasp Mrs. Gunliffe by the arm. "Where's himself?" she said, holding her hand upon her beating heart that she might husband her breath. "Who is it you mean?" said Mrs. Gunliffe, who participated in the family feud against Trengloss and his granddaughter. "What does the girl clutch me for in that way?" "He's dying then, that's all." "Who is dying? Is it old Malachi? If the old man's bad, we'll send someone down." "It ain't Dada, it's Barty. Where's himself? Where's the master?" But by this time Mrs. Gunliffe was in an agony of despair and was calling out for assistance lustily. Happily Gunliffe, the father, was at hand, and with him a man from the neighbouring village. "Will you not send for a doctor?" said Mally. "Oh, man, you should send for the doctor." Whether any orders were given for the doctor she did not know, but in a very few minutes she was hurrying across the field again towards the path to the cove, and Gunliffe with the other man and his wife were following her. As Mally went along, she recovered her voice, for their step was not so quick as hers, and that which to them was a hurried movement allowed her to get her breath again. And as she went, she tried to explain to the father what had happened, saying but little, however, of her own doings in the matter. The wife hung behind, listening, exclaiming every now and then that her boy was killed, and then asking wild questions as to his being yet alive. The father, as he went, said little. He was known as a silent, sober man, well spoken of for diligence and general conduct, but supposed to be stern and very hard when angered. As they drew near to the top of the path, the other man whispered something to him, and then he turned round upon Mally and stopped her. "If he has come by his death between you, your blood shall be taken for his," said he. Then the wife shrieked out that her child had been murdered, and Mally, looking round into the faces of the three, saw that her grandfather's words had come true. They suspected her of having taken the life in saving which she had nearly lost her own. She looked round at them with awe in her face, and then, without saying a word, preceded them down the path. What had she to answer when such a charge as that was made against her? If they chose to say that she pushed him into the pool and hit him with her hook as he lay amidst the waters, how could she show that it was not so? Poor Mally knew little of the law of evidence, and it seemed to her that she was in their hands. But as she went down the steep track with a hurried step, a step so quick that they could not keep up with her, her heart was very full and very high. She had striven for the man's life as though he had been her brother. The blood was yet not dry on her own legs and arms where she had torn them in his service. At one moment she had felt sure that she would die with him in that pool, and now they said that she had murdered him. It may be that he was not dead, and what would he say if he should ever speak again? Then she thought of that moment when his eyes had opened, and he had seemed to see her. She had no fear for herself, for her heart was very high. But it was full also, full of scorn, disdain, and wrath. When she had reached the bottom, she stood close to the door of the hut waiting for them, so that they might precede her to the other group, which was there in front of them, at a little distance on the sand. "He is there, and Dada is with him. Go and look at him," said Mally. The father and mother ran on, stumbling over the stones, but Mally remained behind by the door of the hut. Barty Guncliffe was lying on the sand where Mally had left him, and old Malachi Trengloss was standing over him, resting himself with difficulty upon a stick. "Not a move he's moved since she left him," said he. "Not a move. I put his head on the old rug, as you see, and I tried on with a drop of gin, but he wouldn't take it. He wouldn't take it." "Oh, my boy," said the mother, throwing herself beside her son upon the sand. "Hold your tongue, woman," said the father, kneeling down slowly by the lad's head. "Whimpering that way will do un no good." Then, having gazed for a minute or two upon the pale face beneath him, he looked up sternly into that of Malachi Trengloss. The old man hardly knew how to bear this terrible inquisition. "He would come," said Malachi. "He brought it all upon himself." "Who is it struck him?" said the father. "Sure he struck himself as he fell among the breakers." "Liar!" said the father, looking up at the old man. "They have murdered him! They have murdered him!" shrieked the mother. "Hold your peace, woman," said the husband again. "They shall give us blood for blood." Mally, leaning against the corner of the hovel, heard it all, but did not stir. They might say what they liked. They might make it out to be murder. They might drag her and her grandfather to Camelford jail, and then to Bodmin and the gallows, but they could not take from her the conscious feeling that was her own. She had done her best to save him, her very best, and she had saved him. She remembered her threat to him before they had gone down on the rocks together, and her evil wish. Those words had been very wicked, but since that she had risked her life to save his. They might say what they pleased of her, and do what they pleased. She knew what she knew. Then the father raised his son's head and shoulders in his arms, and called on the others to assist him in carrying Barty towards the path. They raised him between them carefully and tenderly, and lifted their burden on towards the spot at which Mally was standing. She never moved, but watched them at their work, and the old man followed them, hobbling after them with his crutch. When they had reached the end of the hut, she looked upon Barty's face, and saw that it was very pale. There was no longer blood upon the forehead, but the great gash was to be seen there plainly, with its jagged cut, and the skin livid and blue around the orifice. His light brown hair was hanging back, as she had made it to hang when she had gathered it with her hand after the big wave had passed over them. Ah, how beautiful he was in Mally's eyes, with that pale face and the sad scar upon his brow. She turned her face away, that they might not see her tears, but she did not move, nor did she speak. But now, when they had passed the end of the hut, shuffling along with their burden, she heard a sound which stirred her. She roused herself quickly from her leaning posture and stretched forth her head as though to listen. Then she moved to follow them. Yes, they had stopped at the bottom of the path and had again laid the body on the rocks. She heard that sound again, as of a long, long sigh, and then, regardless of any of them, she ran to the wounded man's head. "He is not dead," she said. "There, he is not dead." As she spoke, Barty's eyes opened, and he looked about him. "Barty, my boy, speak to me," said the mother. Barty turned his face upon his mother, smiled, and then stared about him wildly. "How is it with thee, lad?" said his father. Then Barty turned his face again to the latter voice, and as he did so his eyes fell upon Mally. "Mally," he said. "Mally." It could have wanted nothing further to any of those present to teach them that, according to Barty's own view of the case, Mally had not been his enemy. And in truth, Mally herself wanted no further triumph. That word had vindicated her, and she withdrew back to the hut. "Dada," she said, "Barty is not dead, and I'm thinking they won't say anything more about our hurting him." Old Gloss shook his head. He was glad the lad hadn't met his death there. He didn't want the young man's blood, but he knew what folk would say. The poorer he was, the more sure the world would be to trample on him. Mally said what she could to comfort him, being full of comfort herself. She would have crept up to the farm if she dared, to ask how Barty was. But her courage failed her when she thought of that, so she went to work again, dragging back the weed she had saved to the spot at which on the morrow she would load the donkey. As she did this, she saw Barty's pony still standing patiently under the rock, so she got a lock of fodder and threw it down before the beast. It had become dark down in the cove, but she was still dragging back the seaweed when she saw the glimmer of a lantern coming down the pathway. It was a most unusual sight, for lanterns were not common down in Malachi's Cove. Down came the lantern rather slowly, much more slowly than she was in the habit of descending, and then through the gloom she saw the figure of a man standing at the bottom of the path. She went up to him, and saw that it was Mr. Gunliff, the father. "Is that Mally?" said Gunliff. "Yes, it is Mally. And how is Barty, Mr. Gunliff?" "You must come to un yourself now at once," said the farmer. "He won't sleep a wink till he's seed you. You must not say but you'll come." "Sure, I'll come if I'm wanted," said Mally. Gunliff waited a moment, thinking that Mally might have to prepare herself, but Mally needed no preparation. She was dripping with salt water from the weed which she had been dragging, and her elfin locks were streaming wildly from her head. But, such as she was ready. "Dada's in bed," she said, "and I can go now, if you please." Then Gunliff turned round and followed her up the path, wondering at the life which this girl led so far away from all her sex. It was now dark night, and he had found her working at the very edge of the rolling waves by herself, in the darkness, while the only human being who might seem to be her protector had already gone to his bed. When they were at the top of the cliff, Gunliff took her by the hand and led her along. She did not comprehend this, but she made no attempt to take her hand from his. Something he said about falling on the cliffs, but it was muttered so lowly that Mally hardly understood him. But, in truth, the man knew that she had saved his boy's life, and that he had injured her instead of thanking her. He was now taking her to his heart, and as words were wanting to him, he was showing his love after this silent fashion. He held her by the hand as though she were a child, and Mally tripped along at his side, asking him no questions. When they were at the farm gate, he stopped there for a moment. "Mally, my girl," he said, "he'll not be content till he sees thee, but thou must not stay long with him, lass. Doctor says he's weak like, and wants sleep badly." Mally merely nodded her head, and then they entered the house. Mally had never been within it before, and looked about with wondering eyes at the furniture of the big kitchen. Did any idea of her future destiny flash upon her then, I wonder? But she did not pause here a moment, but was led up to the bedroom above stairs, where Barty was lying on his mother's bed. "Is it Mally herself?" said the voice of the weak youth. "It's Mally herself," said the mother, "so now you can say what you please." "Mally," said he, "Mally, it's along of you that I'm alive this moment." "I'll not forget it on her," said the father, with his eyes turned away from her. "I'll never forget it on her." "We hadn't a one but only him," said the mother, with her apron up to her face. "Mally, you'll be friends with me now?" said Barty. To have been made lady of the manor of the Cove for ever, Mally couldn't have spoken a word now. It was not only that the words and presence of the people there cowed her and made her speechless, but the big bed and the looking-glass and the unheard-of wonders of the chamber made her feel her own insignificance. But she crept up to Barty's side and put her hand upon his. "I'll come and get the weed, Mally, but it shall all be for you," said Barty. "Indeed you won't then, Barty dear," said the mother. "You'll never go near the awesome place again. What would we do if you were took from us?" "He mustn't go near the hole if he does," said Mally, speaking at last in a solemn voice, and imparting the knowledge which she had kept to herself while Barty was her enemy, "specially not if the wind's any way from the nor'ard." "She better go down now," said the father. Barty kissed the hand which he held, and Mally, looking at him as he did so, thought that he was like an angel. "You'll come and see us tomorrow, Mally?" said he. To this she made no answer, but followed Mrs. Guncliffe out of the room. When they were down in the kitchen, the mother had tea for her, and thick milk, and a hot cake, all the delicacies which the farm could afford. I don't know that Mally cared much for the eating and drinking that night, but she began to think that the Gunliffs were good people, very good people. It was better thus, at any rate, than being accused of murder and carried off to Camelford prison. "I'll never forget it on her, never," the father had said. Those words stuck to her from that moment, and seemed to sound in her ears all the night. How glad she was that Barty had come down to the Cove. Oh yes, how glad. There was no question of his dying now, and as for the blow on his forehead, what harm was that to a lad like him? "But father shall go with you," said Mrs. Gunliff, when Mally prepared to start for the Cove by herself. Mally, however, would not hear of this. She could find her way to the Cove whether it was light or dark. "Mally, thou art my child now, and I shall think of thee so," said the mother, as the girl went off by herself. Mally thought of this too as she walked home. How could she become Mrs. Guncliffe's child? Ah, how? I need not, I think, tell the tale any further. That Mally did become Mrs. Guncliffe's child, and how she became so the reader will understand. And in process of time the big kitchen and all the wonders of the farmhouse were her own. The people said that Barty Guncliffe had married a mermaid out of the sea, but when it was said in Mally's hearing, I doubt whether she liked it. And when Barty himself would call her a mermaid, she would frown at him, and throw about her black hair, and pretend to cuff him with her little hand. Old Gloss was brought up to the top of the cliff, and lived his few remaining days under the roof of Mr. Guncliffe's house. And as for the Cove and the right of seaweed, from that time forth all that has been supposed to attach itself to Gunliffe's farm, and I do not know that any of the neighbours are prepared to dispute the right. The end. Thank you for listening. It's a lovely one, that. I think when I was looking it up, I think it might have been made into a film or something. Yeah, or some kind of other media. But yeah, I like that one. It's lovely. Now kiss. Well, yeah. I mean, not quite at that moment, but they did eventually. But yeah. Thank you all very much for being here. I don't think I'll raid over tonight just because we're finishing a little bit later than usual. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. That was our first stream back after the new year. You unexpectedly missed all but the last 10 minutes, but it sounded very sweet. I have to check out the VOD. Yeah, well, I really like the description of, like, yeah, a dark Cornwall coastline. Just, yeah, very, very evocative of, you know, I don't know, just that kind of story and the wildness of that kind of landscape. But yeah. Well, thank you all very much for being here. Sam should in theory be back on Saturday with the next part of The Human Chord. So stay tuned for that. And yeah. Go take care of yourselves. Be the wonderful people that you are, etc. And yeah, I hope you all have a good rest of your days, nights, whatever. Thank you all for being here, and yeah, have a wonderful night. Good night and goodbye.